which is 10 things that you should know about grants. Okay, so welcome everybody. My name is Pat Gross, a community entrepreneur. And also we have what we call the Grant Writing Help Desk, which you can find at getthatgrant.com. I'll explain more about what's in there later, but please feel free. There's plenty of free resources as well as resources depending on what stage you are at with the grant writing process. Who am I? Why are we here today? So my name, as I said, Pat Gross. Now I've got over 30 years experience in the grants field, in the funding field. And that started off when I was working in the UK for an organisation. Well, it was actually within a university, a unit that was showing not-for-profits, local government, education, higher education, and community development and voluntary organisations, the whole range, everybody except business, basically, on how to get funding out of Europe, out of the European Union. And so we were doing, grant writing, EU funding for beginners, project management, how to manage those projects, how to record success, etc. And then I came over to Australia in 2000, and lo and behold, having escaped the whole funding field, I found myself working in a government role, which was around funding. So basically what makes me unique is I've worked on both sides of the funding fence, both here in Australia and in the UK, because just before I left the UK, I inherited a training fund which was in its infancy and which I developed multi-million pounds in those days. And as a consequence of it, we had 52 projects running underneath the training fund. That really burned me out, which is why I ended up escaping to Australia. Well, not really, that's my excuse. So I've been involved in all aspects of funding, from designing the program guidelines, right, the whole concept, even the research before putting in a program together, because there is a consultation process, and developing the selection criteria, right through to actually being on this side of the fence, which is applying for the funding and helping clients actually run their projects. All right, so why are we here today? Well, grants are, and I'll explain them, how they work, and there's a couple of real good gems in there, which I'll explain as we go along. But grants actually solve a lot of problems, or they're working to new opportunities. And I've given 4 examples here, sort of diverse in the not-for-profit space, which are a little bit diverse. So we've got here solar panels. Now they're for businesses as well. The whole idea of the new economy, of the solar economy, of community batteries, of renewables, of new ways to break down plastic, water, etc. The whole government agenda at the moment, not whole, but a large part of the government agenda is around sustainability, environmental, renewables, etc. And that is a responsibility both in the business space and in the not-for-profit space. I mentioned community batteries. That's a great not-for-profit opportunity. It's not just about solar, etc. There's other things. I think your food relief comes in there as well to some degree, in relation to where it's being sourced and local food, access to local food. Water over the road, that was just the latest and in a sort of a series of climate change disasters, shall we say. Climate change is a disaster. It's the sort of effects that it's having with things like the floods, and previous to that was the bushfires, and then previous to the bushfires was the drought. So there's constantly some sort of climate influence where the government moves its money around. So what we're finding is that for about 2 to 3 years after the bushfires, there was a lot of money in the bushfire recovery space, which is now then moved into the flood recovery space. And that's what we're finding when we've got clients who have built up a momentum with funding out of bushfire recovery, and then found that out of bushfire recovery, and then found themselves high and dry because the money is now being diverted, or the opportunities are being diverted to the flooding, the communities that are being affected by flooding. I know it sounds a bit, high and dry flooding. That's not meant to be not meant to be a joke. But having said that, the government priorities move around according to where their perceived greatest need is. Doesn't necessarily acknowledge that for organisations that become dependent on that funding, that haven't built their sustainability from that, as in organizational sustainability, and where they move forward from that, find themselves without funding. Mental health matters. That's something that's constantly on the government agenda, coming through in different ways. Mental health as impacts of COVID, mental health as an impact of disasters, because the mental health problems don't really show themselves until at least 2 to 5 years after the event. Mental health in terms of domestic violence, etc. So these are the mental health, one way or another, is constantly on the government agenda. And I've put there the multicultural, the settlement into Australia, because Australia is dependent on a growing workforce. But in order to do that and bring families over, or even humanitarian refugees, does need a whole of community acceptance of the different culture and diversity. And diversity, as this is cultural diversity, but it can also be diversity in terms of people, LGBTQI, etc. So that's always on the agenda as well. So I'm trying to say that the story is evolving. The money follows the need or the opportunity. And if you become reliant on a particular source of funding, you could find yourself in trouble unless you move to something different, or you plan to move. And that's where we can help you as well, in terms of how you develop a strategy so that you don't become dependent on one source of funding. Right, so at the end of the presentation, I have actually, we have a manual called Teach Yourself Grant Writing. Ask me at the end of the session if there's, more about this, and I can show you. Right, let's get started. So 10 things you should know about grants. Okay, right. This is before you get started. Grants are not donations, nor are they free money most of the time. I've put a rider on that because, it's easy for somebody to prove me wrong. What I mean there is that grants are for a specific purpose. They are project-based, so you must have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Not normally. Donations, the donor will donate, but doesn't specifically micromanage, and we use the word micro, like to manage or to have a really deep insight into what you're doing. They're not looking at specific outcomes, whereas a grant does. So if you're an organization that has donations as your income stream, that's great. If you've got grants as an income stream, they are for a specific purpose, and that is to lead to a change, to an improvement, or to get some results. They're not free money, now, especially government grants, because they come from the public purse. Having worked in a government department, once upon a time, we found that we were giving grants to lead peak bodies, but they weren't. We were saying, well, where's this money going? So we actually made them accountable. So that was the only time when I've really seen money being handed out and not actually seen what the outcome of that is. Next time we ran that particular program, the associations, the lead bodies, had to come to us with a project plan of what they were going to do and the results they were going to achieve. And then we were able to justify why we had given those people that money, the results that they got. So grants, if you're looking for a grant, it's for a specific purpose. It's got a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it's going to lead to some kind of change. It might not get the results that you're looking for, but that doesn't matter. Having worked in the department I worked in, they said there was no project was a failure. It just didn't have the outcomes that you expected. Okay, you cannot avoid the red tape. Grants come with conditions that must be met. Again, we were handing out recurrent funding, not handing out, but we were contracting to recurrent funding, and the recipients were going, well, why do we need to report this? Why do we need to have these templates and fill them in? Why do we need to do this? Why do we need to do that? And it was like constant. And I've heard this again in different situations. Yet there are organisations on the outside who would love the opportunity to get their hands on the money. So when you get when you do get a grant, there are conditions. Before you apply for a grant, if there's an opportunity to look at the contract, because it will tell you that there's milestones, there's going to be reporting that needs to be done. You need to have insurances in place that you'll need. There might be something specific about timeframes, etc. These are non-negotiables. When they send you put onto the system an example of a contract, most of us ignore that. But actually, have a look at it, because there might be something in that contract that's saying, oh, no, we can't do this. So there's no point applying in the first place. You have got to follow the conditions. Right, this is the number one thing you should know before you sit down and write a grant application. During COVID lockdowns, the number of applications for grants tripled. So, for instance, if it had been for every successful grant, there were 3 or 4 unsuccessful prior to 2020. During the lockdown period, you were looking, if it was 13 to 1, it was a lot more than that. So funders were really sort of, they had, they could pick and choose, to be honest. And so I was getting calls from businesses and not-for-profits saying, we've applied for grants, we were unsuccessful, please can you tell us what we did wrong? So I would ask them to send me their submission, and I could tell you I didn't get past the first question. Every single time they were telling the funder what they wanted. It's not about what you want, it's about the product or service. What you want to do is going to help the funder meet their objectives and their outcomes. That is the number one secret to a successful application. If you don't get that right, then you're just not going to be there, because you're just going to say, this is what we want. Fine. This is the government, if it's government or philanthropic, it's somebody else's money. Why should they give you the money? Because that's a donation. What they're doing is saying, we have got this big picture that we want, result that we want. We've got the financial resources, we've got the big goals, but what we don't have is the people on the ground. What you're saying is, we see that same problem that you see. We've got this thing that we can do that will help resolve part of the problem. And we've got the people on the ground, we've got the resources, but what we don't have is the financial resources. So therefore, the people with the financial resources and the big picture, you're contracting with them to say, and to say, oh, you're applying to them to say, we can help you here. We know what the need is. We know exactly what you're doing, and that's how you demonstrate the need. Is you're showing them that you know what their problem is. There's a difference. So it's not about what you want. It's about how what you want to do meets the funder's objectives and outcomes. You get that right, and you're on your way. All right. The next one is the funder doesn't know who you are, even if they do. And what I mean there is do not assume that they know the background of what you're doing, that they know the problem, that they know the community that you're talking about. You have to explain as if you're explaining to a 9-year-old child. Keep everything simple, and you tell them, you give them the figures, you give them the data. If there's a need, then look at the demographics, and there are certain websites and stuff that you can find which can easily provide that demographic or economic information. Any research you've done, any feedback you've got, you have got to be able to explain. Numbers actually help people fix the story in their mind. You can be vague, but that could be anywhere, anytime. You have to be specific to location. You have to be specific to the market. You have to be specific to the community. So it's all about, if you're writing that application, you have got to write as if you're trying to convince somebody from another country. Give the detail. They may know, but this is the thing. And this is what happened in the government, and it happens in other areas as well, is when your application is being assessed, it's being assessed against others. And the people who are looking at it might not be, well, they certainly might not be the people that you're familiar with. They might be somebody from somewhere else completely who have no idea. What they are doing is scoring blindly against certain the criteria of the questions. So answer the questions. And if for instance, so they will mark against that. So you have to be very clear. Now, you get funded. 5 years down the line, the Auditor General will audit the government department's process for acceptance of funding for funding management, and they will have a look at samples of the application forms. And if they see an application form, they're thinking, this doesn't look right. Where's the information? Then that government department is actually in the wrong. It's important. I'll give you an example. Back in 2013, we were very successful with a client to put in an application for gentrification that was facing a community that was facing gentrification. And we were successful. Right. Today, that location has been gentrified. So if somebody was looking at what this doesn't make sense, this community, that's not who's this community, they wouldn't understand that 5 years ago that community was a whole different community. What we did, and actually we got a very, very good excellence tick from the government at the time, is we threw all the data. We compared with a similar process that had happened. This was in Melbourne, similar process that had happened in Sydney a few years before. So we were able to quantify, and we were able to give the picture a snapshot of the community at that moment in time. So, the funder doesn't know who you are, even if they do, because they have got to, things can change in a 5-year period. All right. You must be able to do what you say you will. So that's why funders want to know about your capacity and capability. They want to know, and they want to know that you've been able to plan out exactly what you're going to do and who's going to do it. So the project plan will always be a question in the application form. And It can be a simple one, or it can be one where you've got a Gantt chart. So we have one with a matrix with all the crosses and under certain timelines. But there will always be a question about, how long is this project going to take? Break it down into stages. We have a process that we use, but they need to know that you are able to actually you have planned out, and it's not just something that you've got out of somebody's head. And also your capability. First of all, so you would need going back to that project management, you'll also need to have the right staff in place. You will have a project manager or a coordinator, whatever you want that title to be, but you must have somebody who's in charge of the day-to-day operations. Even if it's a volunteer, it doesn't matter. So you need to have somebody, and then the technical staff, etc. So they need to know that you've got the resources, or volunteers, that you've got the resources to do what you want to do. And your capability. So that's also your accountability, so that you're at the organizational level. And that's why in the application forms, they ask that the sign-off person is somebody at the top with responsibility. It could be somebody on the committee or board, or the CEO. The reason they ask for that is because they've in the past, the funders have had their fingers burned because somebody's put an application in, and then it's not been actually supported at the highest level. So the contract is at the highest level. So they want to make sure that your committee, board, whoever is at that level, has actually got on it the breadth of experience in project management, in financial control, in the area of what you're applying for the funding of. They want to know. This is our key here to reducing the risk to government or to the funder, full stop, whoever that may be. Okay, number 6, the funder controls the clock. In other words, if you're applying for a grant, first of all, there is a deadline for, how long you've got to apply for. Usually it's within a 4 to 6 week period. They don't actually normally give deadlines, extensions. It does happen, but never prepare for an extension. Make sure that you can get your application in on time. I've been caught with clients twice this year who didn't get the information in by the deadline, but even by midnight on whatever date, and they've tried to put information in afterwards. They've got the information, but when you click the button, it goes out the system. You missed the deadline. I know the second one. The first one was, again, it was a stressful situation. Didn't get us the information until right at the last possible minute. Don't ever do that, please, because systems can go down at the last possible minute, and they have done for us in the past. So the funder controls the clock. If you're actually, the clock is also when you've the timeline that you're given to actually deliver the project. So make sure if it's a 12-month delivery deadline, you can meet that 12-month delivery deadline. And what they also do is build in some period milestones in that time frame. And those milestones are where they give you money as long as you've done the first bit of that accountability, which you mentioned earlier. So they will give you money out in portions, and if this is something to be mindful of. If you get to say you might have 2 or 3 milestones, but you've still got to draw down some money, and you don't think you're going to actually finish the project, or it's falling over, let them know before you draw down the last portion of funding, because that allows them to reallocate the funding. If you inform them after you've sort of received your last funding and you still haven't finished your project, and you need to return the funding because that will happen, they will work with you. The funder will work with you as much as possible to try and spend the money legitimately. But if you find that you have to hand the money back, they will not be best pleased, because it literally means that that money may go back into the central system and not back into that project funding, and they can't reallocate. So the funder controls the clock, but they're also controlled by the clock. So make sure that you can do everything within the timeframes that's given. And I know that some of these longer term sort of change projects, there was a client that had a 3-year project, got to the end of the 3-year projects and realized actually it was a 5-year project because the change in the community took longer. So that came out in the evaluation. So yes, but there's nothing they could do about that because the project came to an end, and that was it. Sometimes I say always consider what you can do after the funding has stopped. Whether it's another pathway to the funding, you cannot be funded for the same thing twice, but there might be a change or a tweak that will be acceptable. But otherwise, what is it? What's the legacy from the current funding that you can carry forward and use in the next time frame? Right, number 7. A good submission proves you are low risk. If I say to you the number one thing that you need to know is it's not about what you want, it's what the funder wants, I would say this is number 2, because everything that the funder asks for, you answer it in such a way that you're showing to them that you are a low risk. So evidence of need, you've done your homework, low risk. You can determine, that nobody else is doing it in your area, low risk. You're able to deliver because you've got a project plan, low risk. You've got the resources, low risk. You've got the capability at the top, low risk. Your budget could be low risk. The fact that you've thought about risk, low risk. You may be looking at the outcomes, and you can prove that you can measure the outcomes, low risk. It could be that you've been required to put in your financials for the last 2 or 3 years, low risk. So there's lots of opportunities along the way to demonstrate that you are low risk. I know because I used to look at some applications, or I used to look at some of the financials, or whether they could bring them. There were clues that there was a risk here. Now, do not be afraid of submitting your financials. It just means to show that you've actually been operating for 3 years and that you've been working. So it just to show that you're an organized entity. All right, so writing an application is like marketing on steroids. So you need to be very clear about your pitch, why you stand out from everybody else, the proof of concept. In other words, you've evidenced the need, and you can show that there's a good reason to do this, and your capacity to deliver. So I always say a good application is marketing on steroids. It has to jump out from the page. Even believe it or not, the title, the short title at the beginning, if you can make that punchy and quirky, at least it gets you started. Number 9, not all applications get funded, and that is a fact. I know that just recently we had an application. We knew it was going to be a big one. We knew it was going to be a big ask, but it was something that is a great big need. Of course, it did get funded, but believe me, didn't get funded. We knew that, but the head of a government department has been in touch with the client and is working with the client behind the scenes to help them to get this concept over the line. It wasn't nothing to do with the quality of the grant itself. It was more to do with changing government priorities. So, and also being on the other side of the fence, having been on, sometimes it might be to do with geographic spread, or there's other factors involved that are outside of. It could be also, I was thinking also that there may be a few applications from your area, and they just want to, well, 2 things can happen. They either pick out the most outstanding, and the others, although they may be good, there's just a duplication of effort, or they go back to the applicants and say, can you work together? And that's something we've done in the past when I was working in the government, was to ask applicants to actually talk to each other and get funded between them, or it could be that neither of them got funded. And number 10, all grants are different, but they're all asking for the same things. And I've always sort of mentioned these: evidence of need and solution, a good plan and measured results, your capability, your financial capacity, your risk mitigation, and the evidence success. In other words, it's a solid business case. Now, what we're going to do is, it's not the same checklist, but we'll put in the chat space just a summary of all those 10 points. So you can take them away today. I mentioned that we have a grant writing help desk at getthatgrant.com, and we've got them. And if you have a look there, if you go over there at some stage afterwards, we've got what grants are, where to start looking, DIY grant writing if you want to do it yourself, or if you want to engage a grant writer, you can work through us. Oh, and we've also got some professional development, learning and development courses that we've got up there. And okay, so now I've got an offer to you today. We've actually got Teach Yourself Grant Writing Manual, and it really is thorough. I can show it afterwards, but it's really thorough. I can send it out. And what we're saying to you is if it's Australian anyway, it's Australian based. Doesn't matter who the funder is. We're really going. It's a real deep dive into how to do the whole process from where to go. Now we sell that for $97, so you can actually go online to buy it for $97, or if you put something in the chat space today, if you're interested, we can actually do a deal with you and do it for $47 just for attending today. That's an option we're going to give you, and we can have a look at that afterwards if you so wish. Okay, so just before we move on, I'll just say, look, next time we're actually looking at how do you build a business case for a grant. Those areas we were just talking about, I'll go through each of those steps and give you some clues and some pointers of where to look to get the information that you need to build a business case. And when I say a business case, I mean it's one of those things that you can put in a drawer. You've got an idea. You put it down, put it in a drawer. We've got a nap as well. And then when the right opportunity comes